Eva, when she was studying at the Singers Forum, was a very beautiful French woman. She was very tall, she was very majestic, she was very calm and very serious, and had something almost of a tragic air about her. It wasn't anything you could put your finger on, but there sort of seemed to be something very dramatic. And she was an opera singer, and so it all fit her very well. It turned out, I found out her life was more dramatic than I realized at first, because at the same time that she was studying Verdi's Otello and doing the role of Desdemona at the workshop I was teaching, she was doing the scene from Act 4 where Otello comes and strangles Desdemona. And at the same time, as I found out somewhat later, she had married a man in her apartment building who was of African descent but had US citizenship, and she married him for a green card. And she thought all of this was perfectly clear beforehand, but apparently after they got married, he figured he had the traditional rights of a husband in marriage, and as far as she was concerned, that was not part of the bargain. And the scene turned very ugly, and she ended up having to flee in the middle of the night. So this is at the same time that the Moor is strangling her on stage. So Eva had a dramatic life. Eva did fairly well. She went on to Mannes School of Music. She got a degree from Mannes. She performed, I think, for a year or two in New York. She did opera in the park.
Oh, wow.
So she sang with an orchestra, a major role, and that was certainly, I think, as far as most people got to in the Singers Forum. But she ended up moving back to France, giving up her singing career, and she met a man and got married, and they lived very happily for about 10 years until he contracted cancer and passed away. And some years after that, well, Eva was always sending me Christmas cards. Every year she'd send a Christmas card, and she would sign it Eva, but the name on the front of the envelope was Christiane Pessy. And it was like, Christiane Pessy, Place de l'Église, Hongroise, France. And there was no street number. And I didn't know who Christiane Pessy was, and I didn't know how you could possibly deliver a letter with no street, with no number. So one day, out of the blue, Eva called me on the phone. And she had been listening to some cassette recording she had made when she'd come over here for a coaching, and she decided to call me up. And this was like, I hadn't seen her for 25 years. So one thing led to another, and Dennis and I went to France to visit Eva. And there she was, living in the south of France, in the Dordogne, in this exquisitely beautiful area. She had a very large 17th century farmhouse that she had bought with her now deceased husband. And she was living there with the aged mother of an ex-boyfriend as a roommate. And we went and we stayed with her for a week, and we toured all over the Dordogne, and Eva was a completely different person. Well, for one thing, as I found out, her name was not Eva, it was Christiane. Eva was her stage name, and Pessy was the name of the husband that she married, who was of Italian descent. And Eva was just, like I said, she was completely different. She wasn't tragic at all. She was like a farm girl. She was big and she was loud and she could curse up a storm in French. And the whole, because Dennis and I both speak French, we spend most of the time talking French with her, which I never did when she was here in America. And her French, of course, is much better than her English. And it was just like this whole different personality. She was sparkly and she seemed very happy to me. So while we were there, I was disappointed that she had given up vocalizing, because I thought all those years and years and years of work she did working on her voice, and just to stop after all this time. I thought, Eva, you should vocalize. I kept calling her Eva. I refused to call her Christiane. Eva, you should vocalize at least. Just keep your voice in shape just so you have it. I mean, just like half an hour a day, just do warm-up stuff. Tell you what, Eva, I promise you, if you promise to vocalize every day, I will write you Piano Sonata No. 7. And that was something of a leap, because I just finished No. 6, and I was not planning to write 2 piano sonatas in a row, but that's what happened. So I wrote this for Eva. So the first movement is about Eva, the way I knew her when she was in New York. And the second movement is about her husband getting cancer and slowly wasting away and dying. And then at the very end, the soul ascends to heaven. So it's kind of death and transfiguration. That piece is very interesting formally. It's written as a chaconne, which is an old Baroque style where you have a bass line that just repeats over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And in this piece, with a couple of exceptions, it is the same 8-bar, like the bass note in the same 8 bars repeats over and over and over again. But I tried really, really hard not to make that obvious, because I get bored really easily. If anything repeats, I'm already bored halfway through. So it does repeat, but it doesn't sound like it. When I get the CD, I don't suggest you do it now, but when I get the CD and you have it, I suggest you count the bars A, B, C through G. 1, B, C, D, E, F, G, 2, B, C, D, E, F, G, 3, B, C, D. I do that sometimes when I practice, but I always get lost. You know, I just like, I can't find the notes and remember what letter comes next, so I don't do that. But it's an interesting exercise. And then the last movement is the way Ava is now, as I Okay, let's all go eat.
Just some footnotes. The cake that we have is made by the fellow who made our wedding cake 4 years ago.
Oh.
And he just opened up a shop 11 weeks ago on Broadway on 212th Street, so I had to travel a bit this morning.